Hello, I'm the PC Expert Amateur, and we're going to talk today about when you mount an AIO, you have to pay attention to where the pump is in it. Because if you don't, you can end up burning out your AIO, worst case. Second worst case scenario is you're going to have higher temperatures than are good or that you can get from that particular AIO. There are three places where you can find the radiator. So you can find the radiator like on this ASA Cube 360. It's actually right here in the radiator. Sorry, the pump is in the radiator. Or like on this Thermalright Frozen Magic Scenic version 2, it'll be on the pumps between here and here somewhere. Or on like this Arctic Liquid Freezer 3, it'll be in the block. Now, each of these has different requirements for where you can place things. One thing, however, in common for all three of these designs is that when you mount the block, it doesn't matter whether it's a square or round or odd shaped or whatever it is. Like the Liquid Freezer 2 has kind of a bizarre shaped block. It doesn't matter whether there's a VRM pump or not, like there is on this one. The important thing is that you must make sure that the tubes are never exiting from the bottom of the block. Not this one, not this one, and not this one. And I don't think it's a coincidence that for all three of these manufacturers, none of them show the tubes coming out of the bottom. Now, why is that, you may ask? Well, it's very simple. When you have water and air mixed together, air is going to go where? To the bottom or the top? Well, obviously, unless it's heavy air, which you're not going to have in something like this, the air is going to rise to the top of the system. Now, if the system is very turbulent, the air may circulate repeatedly through these things. However, if you have the tubes entering and exiting the bottom of the block, the problem is the air is going to get trapped up here most likely. That means that pump or no pump in here, what's going to end up happening is as the air accumulates in here, the area where the fins are that are helping to do the primary amount of transfer of heat from the block, from the CPU to the cold plate with the fins inside of here, whether there's a radiator, whether there's a pump or not. Sorry, I'm not feeling well, so please understand that, okay? As the air increases in here, with the tubes coming from the bottom, what will happen is that area where the transfer of heat is focused is going to be more and more exposed. And as it's more exposed, the result will be that the temperatures will rise for the CPU and for the block. And that can be damaging. Okay? That's the first thing you need to consider. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's a square or a rectangle or a circle or odd-shaped fan or no fan in the block. The important thing is you don't want the tubes going downward. If they're going left or right, that's pretty good most cases, unless if you look at the tubes and they're oriented toward the bottom of the block on this side or on this side, you want them to be up here or in the middle, but not the bottom. You want them to be at the top or in the middle, not the bottom, because the closer they are to the bottom of the block, the more likely it is that more air will be trapped up here. Now again, the more turbulent the whole system is, the faster the water flow, the less likely that air can accumulate here. But you also have to configure the rest of the system so that doesn't occur, that buildup inside of the block. Okay? So, if you have the pump in the radiator, now the pump radiator in the radiator could be here along this end, or it could be situated somewhere in here, or maybe even here. It doesn't really matter where. The important thing is that if the radiator has a pump in it, you do not ever, ever, ever want to mount this on top. Now, if the radiator's pump is here, you also do not want to mount it where this end of the radiator is up. So that means you'll have to have the radiator with the tubes coming out of the bottom of it to the block. Now that could mean with this kind of a configuration, the best case scenario is to actually mount this on the bottom of your case. But again, you need to make sure the tubes going into the block don't go into the bottom of the block, because then the air can easily get trapped in there. And ideally, you would like to have it, and I'll show you this later. I'm going to take each of these out and demonstrate. But ideally, if you can get it so that the tubes are coming out of the radiator from the bottom and they come out to the top, or they come out to the side, but they're bulging up above the level of the block, the air is going to tend to accumulate up there instead of inside of here. Less damage can occur in the tube than can occur in the block or in the radiator where the pump is. Now, if we talk about this one, the tubes are where the pump is. So in this case, you want to make sure that wherever you mount it, the pump on the tubes is not the highest point in this whole system. So if you've got this mounted on the top and the pump ends up being at the same level as the radiator, you're going to have a problem with air accumulating in the pump. And the pump in these things is small. So if, however, you have got the pump in the block, in this case, it's safe to mount it on the top of the case. It's safe to mount it on the front side of the case. You do not want it on the bottom of the case, although theoretically you could try again having it so that the radiator down here, the tubes go like this into the block. But again, this is not an ideal situation, so you have to consider that. So let's take a look at physically what you're going to see. So let's start with the Arctic Liquid Freezer 3. And again, the pump is in here. And just to make it easier for you, I'm going to take this cap off of here. And the VRM fan is inside of here. Useful thing to have, not required, but it is useful. Now, if you're somebody who does overclocking, or you're doing something else that is extremely demanding for the CPU and the components around the CPU socket, the VRM fans can be an important addition to help controlling temperatures. But for the vast majority of people, a VRM is not necessary. There's nothing wrong with having it, but it's not necessary. And I'm not going to get into analyzing what's good and bad about the liquid freezer specifically. I just want to use this to demonstrate the pros and cons and best practices for placement. And you can see that the pump is right here. It's mounted at sideways like that. And they did this on purpose to make it easy to replace things. That's why this pops off so readily. And there's a lot of things that they took into consideration to make this something that's easy to service, or they can just send a part out to a customer and the customer can pop off the bad part and put on the good part. And it's a definite plus. Also, it's currently on sale, so that's a bigger plus. But so when you're going to mount this thing, you want to make sure, because the pump is in here, number one, you never want to mount it with the tubes coming out like this, because that's going to tend to result in air that's coming into here from the tubes getting stuck up in the top part of the pump. Now, in this particular case, again, we're looking at the pump being down here. So the risks are actually kind of low with this particular model. However, it doesn't mean there aren't risks, because this is where the heat transfer occurs. So if the air builds up in here and exposes enough of this plate, you're going to have inadequate heat transfer and higher temperatures. So you want to have, ideally, you want to have the tubes coming out of the side, or you want to have the tubes coming out of the top. Now, since that's that, the other thing you want to do is you want to try to have the part of the radiator above the level of the pump. So you can mount this particular one on top like this, or like this. You can mount this on the front like this, or like this. And again, it doesn't, the only problem with it being mounted like this is over time there's evaporative effects that go on within an AIO. It doesn't matter which one. The softer the tubing is, the more flexible the tubing is, the more porous it is, and the more rapidly that evaporation will occur and osmosis will bring air in. And that air accumulates at the highest points. Now, if you have the pump like this, then the air can possibly accumulate in the top part there because the tubes are down. Otherwise, with it mounted like this, the air is going to tend to accumulate in this top area up here, and eventually it's going to mess with the flow in, and especially the flow out of the radiator. So if you start hearing a lot of gurgling, it's probably because air has gotten trapped, too much air has gotten trapped up here. Now, there are trade-offs with every positioning that you use. Some of them will give you better temperatures for the CPU and worse temperatures for the GPU. Some of them will give you better temperatures for the GPU and worse temperatures for the CPU. If you have to choose, this is made for the CPU, so prioritize the CPU's temperatures. You can always do other things to help the GPU. You're having problems with your motherboard getting too hot, your VRM's getting too hot, there are things you can do to help. This is made for the CPU, not for something else. Use it within a position that helps your CPU the most. Now, the final thing that you want to think about here is bottom mounting and front mounting, but with the tubes down. So, you can have the tubes coming out of the side or coming out of the top, going down with the AIO mounted in the front like this. All right, it doesn't matter if it's a 120, 240, 280, 360, or 420, 140. It doesn't matter. Same principles basically apply. Although probably not so much in a 140 as the other ones because they're just so small when it comes to positioning of the radiator, which is often called a rad. I don't know why it's not called a RAID, but whatever. That's another thing entirely in computers. So you want to have it like this, with this kind of a pump position. All right? So this means that most of the air in the system is going to get trapped up here where it's going to do very little to no damage. The only possibility is when it gets to the point where there's a lot, like maybe down this far, this fan is going to become fairly ineffective in helping to cool off the radiator. So this part of the radiator is going to get a lot hotter. Hopefully you'll realize at that point that something is going on. Your temperatures may be creeping up and you're not hearing gurgling necessarily, although it's possible. Depends on the design internally of the radiator, how the water moves through the radiator. But generally speaking, this is the best option for mounting your AIO when the pump is in the block for the best possible results. Now, you can do two things as far as fan placement is concerned. The fans can be placed on the inside facing into the case, either blowing into the computer or sucking air out of the computer, or you can have it mounted between the radiator and the case itself. I'm not going to touch on that in this video. I've been working on a series of tests that demonstrates what's best as far as that is concerned. It's easier to have them mounted on the inside than sandwiched between the case and the radiator. Much easier to mount and unmount. If you're doing it one time, it's not such a big deal, but for me, testing over and over and over again, moving it around to the different positions in my case, it's a pain in the butt. And I have, on the one that I'm using for testing, stripped out a couple of the holes here because of all the testing that I've been doing. But for the average person, this will be fine. Now, there is one other position, and that is with the radiator on the bottom. And you definitely would not want to have the block mounted like this, and even like this is going to be high risk because all the air is in your system is basically going to come up into the block and into the pump. Your best case scenario is like this, but even this is not ideal because then the air accumulates here and eventually it impedes flow of water throughout your system. So with this kind of a pump positioning, don't put your radiator on the bottom of your case. Just don't. So let's take a look at an AIO where the pump is in the radiator. Right, this is the Thermalright Frozen Magic Scenic V2. And the pump is not in the block and it's not in the radiator, it's right there. Now, because it's so close to the top of the radiator, this makes it quite similar in the some of the risks of if the radiator has the pump inside of it here or even somewhere in here. However, it does eliminate some problems. I wish they had put it more at a central location like this than so close to the radiator, but I didn't get to make that choice. Thermalright, please put the pump in the middle of the tubes if you can. That'd be, I think, a better solution, a better compromise. Now, obviously, because the pump is not there, you can now mount this on the bottom with the tubes either coming out the side or coming out of the top. And that should be okay. Again, you could end up having an accumulation of air up here in the tubes, and you'll hear noises that'll get louder, gurgling and stuff like that. That can eventually result in poor water flow, for example. And so that's that's a problem that's really unavoidable when you mount the radiator at the bottom. However, in terms of temperatures, while there isn't an air buildup, Usually, as long as there is air intake from the bottom and if there's enough space underneath the bottom of the case, or at some point where they built in air intake underneath where the fans are going to be pulling in air, you should get the best temperatures from this placement. But again, there's always that risk of air buildup in these tubes, or even like this, there's risk of air buildup. So you may have to keep that in mind. Now, if you mount it with the radiator on the top, obviously air is very unlikely to build up here. Now you again want to have your tubes on the side, or you want to have the tubes on the top, not on the bottom, because air can get trapped in the block, and that can mean over time as air builds up that it can eventually affect the efficiency of the block in transferring heat from the CPU into the water and thus to the radiator, so the fans can use the air temperature to neutralize that heat in the radiator. But, as long as it's mounted like this and there's not too much of air buildup in the radiator, because again, air is a poor conductor of temperature for this purpose. So once you get a thick enough layer of air in the top of the radiator, no matter as long as it's on the top, eventually there's going to be a buildup of air. And if there's enough of a buildup, it can somewhat decrease the efficiency. But I would say, and this is just a guess here, but I would say that in this case, there's less risk than, say, if you've got the air all trapped up in here, where one fan eventually will be rendered ineffective because of buildup. Now, that said, if you can find a radiator that actually has a bleed valve, like on Deep Cool, they put a bleed valve in theirs. And that used to be something that was used on the really old school radiator systems in houses, where you'd have a special key, you could turn it and bleed all the air out of the radiator lines and out of the radiator itself, so that the radiators would operate at maximum efficiency. Deep Cool has something kind of like that, where you can bleed air out of the system. Other companies put a fill port where you can open it up and you can add more liquid in, and that also will work to do that. Now, unfortunately, this particular brand does not provide fill ports, at least not on this particular model. So there's no easy way, unless you feel very, very comfortable in drilling a hole into the radiator and having a perfectly fitting, screwed in, plug that'll screw in there, and it'll be airtight, so air isn't going to leak in and water isn't going to seep out and stuff like that, and the pressure will be maintained. Now, again, you can mount it so that the pipes are coming out of the top or the side of the block. You want to try and make sure that the pump itself will not be like this, because that means that air can get trapped in here. So you want to make sure that the pump is at an angle. Right, so aside from the fact that you want this pump angled so that it's not at the same level as the top of the radiator, so that air accumulates here instead of in here, that's basically it for this position. Now, if you want to flip it, if you can actually, because like in my case, I have a fairly large case, and in order for me to flip it, I have to vertically mount my graphics card in order to make it possible for the tubes. These are 450 millimeter long tubes, but my graphics card is very long, and it mounted onto the motherboard prevented my tubes from reaching from here to the bottom of the radiator mounted on the front or the side. So if you mount with on the front or side, and I haven't mentioned this before, but this, front or side, it doesn't matter so much as if you're mounting, you're going to have, again, the tubes coming through the side or through the top and then out the bottom. And again, air will accumulate up here. Eventually, if there's a huge amount of air buildup in here, it can make this fan fairly ineffective, but that would take a long time for it to happen. But this is a very good choice. It's probably the safest choice in terms of air accumulation, in terms of protecting both your CPU and your pump. So let's take a look at the last one where the pump is built into the radiator. Now, please don't misunderstand. Just because I'm showing you these particular AIOs or water coolers does not mean that I'm recommending them. I'm just using them as examples. I can say, based on specifications that and testing that I've seen, both the Thermalright Frozen Magic Scenic version 2 and the Liquid Freezer 2 and 3 are really, really very good choices, whereas the AZA Cube, I haven't seen any tests of it, and the specifications for it don't make me feel very confident in it, but I haven't tested it yet, and I haven't seen data on tests, so I really can't comment on this. This is not about these AIOs, it's about where the radiator is and how you should mount it. Right, so for the AZA Cube, the radiator has the pump right in here. In this case, you absolutely cannot mount this on the top, nor can you mount it with the tubes up. That makes it hard. You don't have a lot of options. Because if you mount it with the tubes up, air is going to build up across the top in here, and it's going to eventually impede the efficiency of the radiator that's over here. If you mount it like this, air is going to more rapidly build up and it's going to be trapped in the pump and fairly rapidly render the pump useless. Again, when you mount it, you want it so that the tubes are coming out of the top or out of the side, not mounted like this. So this is the most limited choice in AIOs, really, is when it's in the radiator. And it doesn't, and if the radiator has the pump somewhere in here, say for example, then that still presents a significant risk of putting it on the top. However, the advantage of having it here as opposed to on the end is at least it's safe to mount it, or relatively safe to mount it here, because you're going to have problems with air buildup here that's going to cause an impedance of water transfer potentially, but at least the pump is not going to be exposed to the air. So, what can you do? Well, there are really only two options. You can either mount it on the bottom with the tubes coming out of the top or the tubes coming out of the side, or you can mount it on the front with the tubes coming out of the bottom, tubes on the side, tubes on the top. And that's really all you can do. So this is the least friendly, because ultimately the only position in which this is safe, no matter where the pump is within the radiator, is like this. Not like this, because again, air can build up in the block chamber. So unless they've got a special block that, for example, has been designed in such a way to prevent water buildup in this area against the inside of the this cold plate, you're really eventually going to have some problems. And as with the Thermalright, this one doesn't have a port where you can bleed out air or where you can add in more water. So unless you're planning on drilling it, it really isn't a good option. So my personal recommendation is, if you're going to buy an AIO, avoid any AIOs that do not have a fill port built into them, because that means once it gets too much liquid in it, unless you feel confident in taking it apart and refilling it and things like that, you're going to end up throwing it away. And that's a shame, because they charge way too much money for these water coolers. Now, water coolers these days are much better than back in the early days when companies started manufacturing these. They were cheaper, however, they were much more prone to failure. These days, there are far fewer problems with leaks. There's less problems with permeation, where air gets in through the tubes and stuff. There are far fewer problems with gunk buildup and stuff, but it does still happen. Now, I know there are some people that figure out a way to remove the tubes from either this end or from this end without doing any damage, and then they can drain and fill that way. So that is a possibility. But if you're going to do that, please wait until you definitely have to do it, because you may damage those parts, at which case, if you can't fill it, it's gone. So don't do it after a year, okay? Choose what's going to work best long term. Choose an AIO that has a fill port, has a bleed valve in it, that kind of thing. And there aren't as many options when it comes to AIOs that have that, or water coolers that have that. Ultimately, you're a lot safer buying an air cooler. Air coolers don't usually fail. The risk of failure is extremely low. Less than 1%, less than 0.001% really. And the only thing that's going to fail is either your thermal paste will become so old that it's unusable, and there are thermal paste and pads that actually get better over time, like the Honeywell PTM 7950, and I think the other one is 7958. Those actually are phase change pastes and pads, and those get better over time. And there are some others that do that as well. The only other point of failure, generally speaking, that's universal between both air and water filters, aside from the thermal paste, the thermal compound, is going to be the fans. Those eventually will fail. And if you buy an AIO with weak fans, you can, and a low powered pump, you can compensate for the weakness of the pump by replacing the fans with high-powered fans. If you buy one with a high-powered pump, there's no point in replacing the fans. You're not going to get much of an improvement in performance. I hope that this video has helped you to understand your options for mounting AIOs, what's safe for each position of the pump, radiator, tubes, and water block. If you have questions, please put them down below in the comments. I will do my best to help you out. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.
I'd like to thank Grindler at Bleeping Computer for allowing me to share my videos and posts on his website. Bleeping Computer has a lot of resources, including vetted programs, malware removal instructions, malware removal volunteers, other kinds of volunteers for IT, cybersecurity information, and more. It's a great place to go. Give it a try. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.